Hearing this story, I no longer want to go into my basement. Mark shared what happened to him. Listen until the end, if you can. I don't believe in ghosts. Never have. I've always been the kind of person who looks for logical explanations first. But what started happening in my house a few weeks ago, I still can't explain it. It started with something simple, something I didn't even think about at first. The basement light. I live alone in a 2-story house with a basement that I rarely use. It's mostly storage, old boxes, some tools, things I haven't touched in years. The basement door is always locked, and I almost never go down there. But one night, as I was heading to bed, I noticed a faint glow coming from under the door. The basement light was on. I frowned. I was sure I hadn't been down there all day. Maybe I left it on the last time I went down. I turned it off, locked the door, and went to sleep. The next evening, I was sitting on my couch watching TV when I noticed it again. A thin sliver of light under the basement door. I stared at it for a few seconds, confused. I knew I had turned it off the night before, and yet there it was on again. I got up, unlocked the door, and flipped the switch off. This time I stood there for a moment just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Everything seemed normal. Maybe a faulty switch? Maybe the wiring was acting up? I wasn't too worried. It was an old house. Stuff like that happens. But then it happened again, and again, every single night, without fail. At first, I convinced myself I was just being forgetful. Maybe I had turned it on without realizing it. Maybe I had some kind of absent-minded habit of flipping the switch whenever I passed by the door. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something didn't feel right. So, I started testing it. One night, I turned the light off and stood there for 5 full minutes, staring at the switch. Nothing happened. Satisfied, I locked the basement door and went upstairs. An hour later, I came down for a glass of water. The light was back on. I checked the door. Still locked. That was the first time I felt uneasy. Something wasn't right. The next day, I replaced the light switch. Simple enough fix. I even called an electrician to check the wiring, just in case. He didn't find anything wrong. Everything looked normal. That night, I turned the light off and waited. This time, I sat on the couch, staring at the basement door from across the room. The TV was on, but I wasn't really watching. My eyes kept flicking toward that thin glow under the door, waiting for it to change. And then around midnight, it did. The light turned on. I didn't move at first. I just sat there, my heart pounding. I was alone in the house. The basement door was locked, and yet the light was on. I stood up slowly, my breath shallow. My hands were cold as I reached for the doorknob. I turned the key, pushed the door open, and stared down the staircase. The basement was empty. There was no sound, no movement, just the exposed bulb hanging from the ceiling, glowing like nothing was wrong. I flipped the switch off. The room plunged into darkness. I hesitated for a second before backing away and locking the door again. Maybe it really was just faulty wiring. Maybe the electrician had missed something. That's what I told myself. But deep down, I already knew something was very, very wrong. By the next morning, I had convinced myself it was an electrical issue. Nothing more. I mean, what else could it be? Lights don't just turn on by themselves. There had to be some kind of explanation, a faulty circuit, a power surge, something. But as much as I wanted to believe that, a part of me wasn't so sure anymore. The basement light wasn't the only strange thing happening. I started noticing little things. My keys wouldn't be where I left them. I put them on the kitchen counter, then find them on the coffee table. Small objects, pins, my phone charger, my wallet, would end up in different places. At first, I chalked it up to me being distracted. Maybe I wasn't paying attention. Maybe I was just tired. But it kept happening. And then there were the sounds. I don't know how to explain it, but my house felt different. The silence was heavier, like the air itself had weight. And sometimes at night, I'd hear noises. Faint, distant, A soft creak, like someone stepping on a floorboard. A quiet shuffling sound. A slow, deliberate tap, always coming from the basement. I tried to ignore it. I really did. One night, I even forced myself to sleep with headphones in, blasting music, so I wouldn't hear anything. But that didn't help, because the problem wasn't just the noises. It was the light. It kept happening, every night. No matter what I did, no matter how many times I turned it off, I'd wake up to find it on again. I even tested it. I turned the switch off, locked the basement door, and put a small piece of tape over the keyhole, just in case. The next morning, the tape was untouched. The door was still locked, and the light was on. At this point, I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. I told a friend about it. Jake, the kind of guy who laughs at ghost stories and always has some logical explanation for everything. He came over one evening, and I told him everything. "Dude," he said, smirking, "it's just bad wiring." "That's what I thought too," I said. "But I already had an electrician check it. He said everything was fine." Jake shrugged. "Well, he must have missed something. Maybe the switch is defective." I replaced it. He raised an eyebrow. "Okay, that's weird. But still, there's got to be a reason. Maybe it's a bad connection in the panel. You should try flipping the breaker next time." He offered to stay the night, just to prove there was nothing to be scared of. I almost said no, but a part of me wanted him to witness it. So we stayed up, played video games, drank beer, kept an eye on the basement door. At around midnight, Jake yawned and stretched. "Dude, nothing's happening. Maybe you're just imagining." The light turned on. We both froze. I turned to look at the basement door. That familiar sliver of light was glowing underneath it. Jake stared at it, then at me. "Okay, he swallowed. "You sure you locked the door?" "Positive." We both stood up. My hands were clammy as I walked to the door and put my hand on the knob. "Locked." Jake exhaled sharply. "Okay, let's check the breaker." We went to the electrical panel in the garage. I flipped the breaker that controlled the basement. The entire basement lost power. We waited a few minutes. Then I turned the breaker back on. We walked back inside. The light was off. Jake let out a breath of relief. "See? Just a glitch." I wanted to believe him. But that night, at exactly 3:14 a.m., I woke up to a familiar glow from under the basement door. The light was back on, and this time, I knew for a fact that it had nothing to do with the wiring. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee and staring at the basement door. The light was off now, but that didn't bring me any comfort. The image of that thin glow from the night before was burned into my mind. Jake had left early, mumbling something about early meetings and a packed schedule. He didn't say much about the light, but his face was pale, and his hands trembled when he thought I wasn't looking. I could tell he was as freaked out as I was, even if he wouldn't admit it. That's when I decided it was time to document what was happening. I ordered a small security camera online, a basic model that I could connect to my phone. It arrived 2 days later, and by that time, the basement light had turned on by itself 3 more times. Each time, the door was locked and the breaker was untouched. I set up the camera in the hallway, positioned directly at the basement door. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. I connected it to my phone, configured the motion detection, and set it to record whenever anything moved near the door. The first night, nothing happened. I checked the footage the next morning. Hours of empty hallway, the basement door unmoving, the lights staying off. The second night, the same thing. No activity. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, whatever was happening had stopped now that it was being watched. Maybe it was all in my head, a trick of stress and sleepless nights. But then came the third night. I was lying in bed, my phone screen glowing softly on the nightstand, displaying the live feed from the camera. The basement door was closed, the hallway dark and still. At 3:14 a.m., the phone vibrated. Motion detected. I sat up, my heart pounding, and stared at the screen. The light was on. No one had entered. The door hadn't moved, but the light was on. Swiping through the footage, I rewound to just a few minutes before the alert. The screen showed the dark hallway, the basement door silent and still. And then, without any warning, the light flickered on. No shadows, no movement, just light. I played the footage again and again, trying to spot something, anything that could explain it. A shift in the shadows, a flicker of motion, a hint of a person or an animal. Nothing, just a light turning on in an empty, locked room. I tried to sleep after that, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the basement door creaking open, a figure standing in the darkness below, watching, waiting. The next night, I stayed up, eyes glued to the live feed. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. The hallway remained dark. The light stayed off. At 2:37 a.m., the screen flickered. The light turned on, but this time, something else happened. A shadow moved across the floor, slow, deliberate, just beyond the range of the camera's focus. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a ripple in the air. It moved from one side of the hallway to the other, pausing in front of the basement door, then disappearing back into the darkness. I rewound the footage, watching it over and over. The shape was indistinct, lacking any real form. But the way it moved, it was like something walking, something that shouldn't be there. I didn't go near the basement door that night. I didn't even get out of bed. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house making my skin crawl. The camera had done its job. It had proved that something was happening. But now, I was left with more questions than answers. What was causing the light to turn on? And what was that shadow moving in the darkness? I didn't sleep that night. I told myself I would, that I'd close my eyes for just a bit, but every time I started to drift off, my mind dragged me back to that footage. The way the shadow had moved, slow, deliberate, like something pacing in front of the door. By the time morning came, I was running on pure adrenaline. I had a decision to make. I could keep pretending this was some weird electrical problem, keep ignoring what I saw, keep telling myself there had to be a rational explanation, or I could face it. So that afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I opened the basement door. The smell of stale air hit me immediately, cold, damp, like a place that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. The single bulb overhead was still, its chain swaying slightly, as if the air had just shifted. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the dim space below. Boxes, a few old pieces of furniture, a metal shelving unit against the far wall. Nothing looked out of place. I took a slow step down, then another, my fingers trailing along the railing. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to close the door, to forget any of this had happened. But I needed to see. I reached the bottom and hesitated, scanning the room. I checked the light switch first, flipping it off, then on again. It worked fine. No delay, no flickering. I moved deeper into the basement, running my hand along the concrete wall. It was cold, solid. Then something caught my eye. In the thin layer of dust covering the floor, just near the middle of the room, there was a mark, a disturbance, like something had been dragged. My stomach tightened. I crouched down, running my fingers over the spot. It wasn't clear, nothing obvious like footprints, but the dust had been shifted, smeared in a strange, sweeping pattern. I followed it, my breath shallow. The streaks led toward the metal shelving unit. I stood up slowly. The shelves were covered in junk, old paint cans, tools, a few cardboard boxes. I reached out, gripping the edge, and gave it a small push. It didn't budge. I let out a breath, shaking my head. What was I even looking for? Some hidden door? A secret passage? I was letting my imagination get the best of me. I turned back toward the stairs. Then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible creak. I froze. It came from behind me. I turned my head slowly, my skin crawling. The metal shelving unit had moved. Not much, barely an inch, but enough. Enough for me to see the sliver of darkness behind it. My entire body locked up. The basement had no windows. No vents big enough for a draft to move something that heavy. And yet, it had moved. Something inside me snapped. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, my heart slamming against my ribs. I reached the top, slammed the basement door shut, and locked it. I stood there, breathing hard, my back pressed against the wood. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, from the other side of the door, a soft, deliberate tap. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Another tap, like fingers, pressing lightly, testing the door. Then silence. I didn't go back down there that day, or the next. I couldn't, but the camera stayed, and that's when things got worse. I didn't go near the basement for 2 days. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after too many sleepless nights, that maybe the shelving unit had shifted because the floor was uneven. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling I had when I stood in front of that door, that something was on the other side, watching, waiting. The camera was still recording, and at this point, I had started checking the feed almost obsessively. During the day, everything looked normal. The hallway was empty, the door was still, the light remained off. But at night, it was a different story. The light continued turning on at random times, always between 2 and 3 a.m., and the motion alerts kept coming. But now, it wasn't just a light. It was the sound. The first time I heard it, I nearly dropped my phone. A knock. 3 of them. Slow. Rhythmic. Right on the basement door. I rewound the footage, my hands clammy. It was faint, but unmistakable. 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced, as if someone or something was standing on the other side, trying to get my attention. I checked the footage from earlier that night, scanning frame by frame. Nothing moved. No one entered the hallway. No shadows. No figures. Just the knocks. The next night, it happened again. 2:41 a.m. 3 knocks. The same pattern. The same slow, deliberate rhythm. I was wide awake this time, sitting in my bed, watching the live feed in real time when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Even through the screen, it made my stomach twist. I didn't move. I didn't get up. I just watched, my breath caught in my throat. For nearly a minute, nothing else happened. Then, right as I was about to close the app, the door handle turned. It didn't open. It just twisted, slowly, as if someone was testing it. I stopped breathing. It lasted for maybe 2 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly, it snapped back into place. The camera didn't pick up anything. No shadows. No figures. Just the sound. The movement. The presence. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. I was going to leave. I didn't care what it was. I didn't care if it was my imagination, faulty wiring, or something worse. I was done. But before I could pack my bags, I had one last thought. If something was trying to get my attention, if something was testing the door, what would happen if I didn't lock it? Would it open? Would something step out? I stared at the door, my fingers gripping the key in my pocket. And then, against every ounce of self-preservation I had left, that night, I left the basement door unlocked. I almost didn't go through with it. Even after days of watching the light flick on by itself, hearing those slow, deliberate knocks, and seeing the door handle turn, I still hesitated. Because deep down, I already knew what would happen, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to see it. But I did anyway. That night, before heading to bed, I stood in front of the basement door, my heart pounding. My fingers felt stiff as I turned the key, unlocking it. I didn't open it. I didn't even touch the handle. I just stepped back, leaving it closed, but now, for the first time in weeks, unlocked. Then, I went upstairs. I didn't go to sleep. Of course I didn't. I lay in bed, my phone in my hands, staring at the live feed from the camera. The hallway was empty. The basement door was shut. 2 a.m. Nothing. 2:30 a.m. Still nothing. For a brief, foolish moment, I started to think that maybe I had been wrong, that maybe I let my paranoia get the best of me. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the light in the basement turned on. I tensed, gripping my phone. My breathing slowed. And then, on the screen, the door handle started to turn. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. The knob twisted, moving so slowly it almost didn't seem real. It wasn't jerky or erratic, like someone fumbling with it. It was precise, controlled. The door creaked open an inch. I stopped breathing. The camera didn't detect anyone. No figures, no shapes, no movement, just the door opening. I stared at the screen, unable to move. The door didn't open all the way. It stopped after about an inch, just enough for a thin, black space to appear between the door and the frame. And then, the light in the basement flickered. The camera feed glitched for half a second. Just a brief distortion, a flicker of static. And when it cleared, the door was wide open. I didn't see it move. I didn't see anything step through. But it was open. My entire body locked up. I could feel the cold sweat on my back, my pulse pounding so hard I could hear it. I stared at the screen, unable to blink. The basement was dark. The light, which had been on seconds ago, was now off. Something was there, standing in the darkness, watching. I knew, without a doubt, that if I went downstairs, I wouldn't be alone. I should have grabbed my keys and left the house right then. I should have run. Instead, like an idiot, I grabbed the bat I kept under my bed. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know what I thought I'd find. But I couldn't just sit there. I had to see. Slowly, I crept out of bed, my legs shaking as I stepped onto the cold floor. I made my way down the stairs, one hand gripping the railing, the other gripping the bat, so tightly my fingers ached. The hallway was dark, except for the thin sliver of moonlight coming through the window. And the basement door, wide open. The air felt heavy, wrong, like the whole house was holding its breath. I stopped just a few feet away, my heart slamming against my ribs. I couldn't see inside. The basement was just a void, a black, endless space. Then, a sound, a soft exhale, not mine, from inside the basement. I turned and ran. I don't remember making the decision. I don't remember thinking. My body just reacted. I sprinted up the stairs, into my bedroom, and slammed the door shut. Then, with shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and checked the camera feed. The basement door was still open. The darkness behind it was still empty. But I knew something had come through. Something was in my house, and I had just locked myself in with it. I sat on my bed, gripping my phone so tightly my hands ached. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. The basement door was still open. The house was silent, and that was the worst part. No footsteps, no creaking floorboards, no rustling fabric, just silence. The kind of silence that isn't really empty, the kind that feels like something is waiting, watching. I wanted to run. Every part of me was screaming to get out of the house, to bolt for the front door and never look back. But my bedroom door was closed, and I knew that something was out there now. I had let it in. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. I just sat there, staring at the camera feed, waiting for something, anything, to appear. But the hallway was empty. The basement door remained open, a gaping black hole leading into nothing. Then, at 3:22 a.m., my phone vibrated. Motion detected. I stopped breathing. My thumb hovered over the screen as I tapped the alert. The video loaded. At first, I didn't see it. Then I did. A shadow, just barely visible at the edge of the frame, near the floor. It was low, lower than a person, like someone was crouched down or crawling. It didn't move like a normal shadow. It shifted, almost like it was dragging itself forward, inching closer to the camera. My body locked up. I felt sick. I watched, unable to look away, as the shadow grew darker, closer. Then the feed glitched. Static, a blur of black and white. When it cleared, the basement door was closed. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I rewound the footage. I played it again. Same thing. The shadow crawled forward. The screen glitched. And then, suddenly, the basement door was shut. No sign of what had closed it. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. I had locked that door every night. It never opened unless I turned the key myself. So if it was closed now, that meant whatever had come through was already inside. In the house. With me. I tightened my grip on the bed, my heart slamming in my chest. I had two options. I could stay in my room, trapped, waiting for whatever was out there to come to me. Or I could face it. I didn't want to. Every instinct told me not to. But I also knew I couldn't stay in that room forever. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. Then, taking the deepest breath I could manage, I stepped toward the bedroom door, and the handle moved. I stopped dead. My pulse roared in my ears. The handle twisted. Not fast, not aggressive, just a slow, deliberate turn. Testing the lock. Testing me. I couldn't breathe. The handle stopped. A second of silence. Then, tap. A soft knock. Right at my door. I clenched the bat, gripping it so hard my knuckles went numb. I wanted to scream, to yell at it to go away, to run. But I did none of those things. I just stood there, frozen, because then, just below the door, I saw it. A shadow, spilling in through the gap under the door. Not a normal shadow. This one moved. It shifted like liquid, stretching, pulsing, creeping toward me. And then, just as it reached my feet, it vanished, like it had been sucked away. And the house went completely, utterly still. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't open the door. I didn't move. I just stood there, gripping the bat, staring at the floor, waiting for the sun to rise. And when morning finally came, when light flooded through my window and the world felt normal again, I finally built up the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty. The basement door was locked. And my camera? My camera had stopped recording at exactly 3:22 a.m., right before the shadow disappeared. Right before everything. Like something didn't want me to see what had really happened. Like something had erased it. And that was the moment I knew. I wasn't dealing with a glitch, or bad wiring, or some trick of the light. I was dealing with something else. Something I didn't understand. Something that was getting stronger. And worst of all, something that wasn't going to stop. The next morning felt like waking up in someone else's house. The light streaming through the windows should have made me feel safe. It didn't. The walls felt thinner, the air heavier, and the basement door, though locked, felt like it was waiting. I had spent the entire night gripping a bat, staring at the floor, afraid to move. And when the sun rose, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. It was getting worse, and I had two choices. I could run, pack a bag, leave, never look back, or I could face it. I don't know why I chose the second option. Maybe because I was too stubborn. Maybe because I knew if I left now, I'd never stop wondering what was in that basement. Or maybe, just maybe, whatever this was wanted me to leave, and I wasn't going to give it what it wanted. So, I did the only thing that made sense. I grabbed my bat, turned on every light in the house, and unlocked the basement door. The knob felt cold, unnaturally cold. I swallowed hard and pulled it open. The stairs yawned below me, leading into the familiar darkness. The air smelled stale, undisturbed. But I knew that wasn't true. Something had been down there, and I needed to see what. I flipped the light switch. The bare bulb flickered once, then steadied. Nothing moved. I took the first step. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight, and for a brief, insane moment, I imagined hands reaching through the gaps between the steps, grabbing my ankles. I shook the thought away and forced myself downward. One step, then another. My breath was shallow, my ears straining for any sound, any sign that I wasn't alone. I reached the bottom. Everything looked normal. Boxes, old furniture, a metal shelving unit in the far corner. And then my eyes locked onto the chair. It was sitting in the middle of the room. I had never put a chair there. I felt a cold ripple move down my spine. I knew my own basement. The chair had always been against the far wall, near the shelving unit. I hadn't touched it in years, but now it was here, in the center, like someone had been sitting in it, like someone had been watching. I took a step closer, gripping the bat so tight my fingers ached. The dust on the floor was disturbed around the chair. The same smeared patterns I had seen before. Something had been dragged, or had crawled. I reached out, hesitating, then gripped the back of the chair. It was warm, like someone had been sitting there just moments ago. I pulled my hand away fast, my heart hammering, and that's when the light went out. My breath caught. Darkness swallowed everything. I spun around, my pulse roaring in my ears. The switch was still in the on position, but the light was dead. I wasn't alone. I felt it before I heard it. A shift in the air. A weight, like something was standing in the darkness, just inches away. And then, a breath, right next to my ear. I swung the bat, wild, desperate. It connected with nothing. I staggered back, my foot catching on something. The chair. It toppled over with a crash. And then, from the darkness, a voice. "Why did you come down?" I ran. I didn't care about the bat. I didn't care about my pride. I turned and bolted up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. The air behind me felt thick, like something was rushing up after me. I slammed into the basement door, throwing my weight against it, and shoved it closed. The moment the lock clicked, the light in the house flickered. For a second, the whole hallway pulsed, dimming and brightening like a dying heartbeat. And then, silence. I stood there, chest heaving, my back pressed against the door, waiting. Nothing. No knocks. No voices. No whispers. But I knew, without a doubt, I wasn't safe. It was still here, and it wasn't done with me yet. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat in my living room, every light in the house turned on, my back against the wall so nothing could creep up behind me. My hands were still shaking from what had happened in the basement. The voice. "Why did you come down?" It hadn't been loud. It wasn't a growl or a scream or anything unnatural. It was just a whisper, soft, curious. But that was what made it worse, because whatever had spoken knew I was there. It had been waiting for me. I checked the camera feed again and again. The hallway was still. The basement door shut tight. But the sense of wrongness in the house hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger. Like the moment I stepped into that basement, something had shifted, and now it was closer. At around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I sucked in a breath and tapped the notification, my stomach twisting. The video loaded. At first, everything looked normal. The hallway was empty. But then, as I watched, the door handle twisted. Slow. Deliberate. I froze. It didn't open. It just turned, as if someone on the other side was testing it. Then, just as suddenly, it snapped back into place. I stared at the screen, heart hammering. Then, the screen glitched. For half a second, the image distorted, black and white static rippling across the feed. And when it cleared, the basement door was open. Just a crack. I rewound the footage. The handle twisted, screen glitched, and then the door was open. I never saw it move, never saw what had opened it, but it had, and I knew, if I stepped into that hallway, I wouldn't be alone. I clenched my jaw, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles went white. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I grabbed my car keys and took a shaky breath. If I moved fast, I could make it. I stood up, and that's when I heard it. A sound, a soft creak from the hallway, like someone had just stepped onto the floorboards, right outside my door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, a whisper, right against the door. "Where are you going?" My body locked up. My stomach dropped. It was right there, right on the other side of the wood, waiting. I took a step back, my legs nearly giving out. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might stop. The whisper was too close. It had never been this close. Then, the doorknob turned. I lost it. I grabbed the lamp next to me and hurled it at the door. The crash echoed through the house, glass shattering across the floor. And then, silence. The doorknob stopped moving. For a long time, I just stood there, my breath ragged, my ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing. And when I finally built up the courage to check the camera feed, the basement door was closed again, like it had never opened, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't safe. And now whatever this was, it was done playing with me. It wasn't just in the basement anymore. It was in the house, and it wanted me to know it. I was done. I don't know why I hadn't left already. Maybe some part of me still clung to the idea that this could be explained, that there was a reason for all of it. But that whisper, "Where are you going?" That was it. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed my bag, threw in whatever I could reach, wallet, phone, car keys, charger. I didn't care about clothes. I didn't care about anything else. I just needed to get out. As I moved toward the door, my pulse racing, I felt something shift in the house. Like the air itself changed, like it knew I was leaving, and it wasn't going to let me. I tried not to think about that. I just kept moving, my shoes crunching over the shattered remains of the lamp. I reached the front door. My hand touched the handle. Click. The sound didn't come from the front door. It came from behind me. I turned my head slowly, every muscle in my body locking up. The basement door was open, wide open. The hallway light barely touched the space beyond it, but I could see enough. The basement was pitch black. The light I had left on was off. But worse, so much worse, the chair that had been in the middle of the basement, the one I had knocked over. It was gone. I swallowed hard, my breath shaking. And then, from deep within the basement, I heard it. A single, slow, deliberate footstep. My entire body screamed at me to run. I turned back to the front door, grabbed the knob, twisted. It wouldn't move. I yanked it harder. Locked. No. I hadn't locked it. It locked itself. Another footstep. I turned back. The basement door gaped open like a mouth. The darkness inside felt alive. And then, something moved. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the light. Something stepped into view. I couldn't see its face. Couldn't see its form. But I could see its eyes. 2 pinpricks of light, staring at me from the darkness. I couldn't breathe. I didn't even know if I was still alive in that moment. Then it spoke. Not a whisper this time. A low, crawling voice that slid beneath my skin. "You let me in?" The lights in the house flickered. A cold wave rushed toward me. I did the only thing I could. I threw myself at the door, slamming my shoulder into it. Once. Twice. The third time, it burst open. I stumbled onto the porch, gasping for air. The second I crossed the threshold, the house went silent. I turned back, heart slamming against my ribs. The basement door was closed. The house was still. Empty. Like nothing had ever happened. Like nothing had ever been there. But I knew the truth. Something had been waiting in that basement, and I had let it in. I didn't go back inside. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I got in my car, started the engine with shaking hands, and drove. I didn't stop until the house was nothing but a distant memory in my rearview mirror. I never went back. I sold the house without setting foot in it again. But sometimes late at night I wonder if the basement light ever turns on, and if someone new is there to see it.